By 1933, unemployment reached 25%, and nearly 3 million children wore homemade clothes from feed sacks. Families gathered by lamplight, quilting scraps into warmth and whittling toys from firewood. These crafts weren't distractions. They were the only way to feel human in a world that had stopped caring. Stay here. You're about to hear the most human side of America's hardest decade. How crafts became lifelines. When everything else fell apart. Most people never imagine how far a family will go to feel normal when the world collapses. In the 1930s, it wasn't just money that vanished. It was the sense of security people had always taken for granted. Picture this. It's 1933. Your father has lost his job. The wheat fields outside town have turned to dust, and your mother is trying to make dinner from the last potatoes in the bin. The radio crackles with news of more bank failures. But as the kerosene lamp flickers on, your neighbors gather around a quilt frame in the living room. For a few hours, the darkness outside can't touch you. Between 1929 and 1939, unemployment soared to 25%, leaving millions without income. Buying anything new, a coat, a toy, even a board game, became unthinkable. So families turned to what they still had: their hands, their creativity, and each other. Quilting circles weren't just about warmth. They were about stitching hope into every scrap of fabric. Whittling wasn't just a pastime. It was a way for fathers to carve a little dignity out of spare wood. And homemade games turned rags and bottle caps into nights of laughter that no economic collapse could take away. I'd bet you never heard this. In some towns, quilting bees made dozens of blankets every winter, then raffled them to buy coal for families in need. If you think crafts were just hobbies, you're about to discover how they became the quiet backbone of resilience. Quilting. You'd never expect a pile of old fabric to save lives. But during the Depression, quilting became more than a craft. It was a lifeline woven from necessity and love. Imagine sitting in a neighbor's parlor in 1934, the air thick with lamp smoke and the soft rhythm of needles moving through cloth. In that year alone, some Kansas and Oklahoma counties organized more than 500 quilting bees, each gathering producing stacks of blankets to keep families alive through brutal winters. Most quilts were pieced together from anything: worn-out dresses, men's work shirts, even feed sacks printed with bright floral patterns. Flower companies began selling sacks in cheerful prints specifically because they knew mothers would turn them into children's clothes and quilt squares. By 1935, over 3 million American homes had at least one flour sack quilt on the bed. Patterns weren't chosen lightly. The double wedding ring symbolized holding families together. The log cabin pattern represented the security everyone prayed for, but so few could afford. In some communities, women stitched their names or small messages of hope into the seams, knowing the quilt might end up in a stranger's hands. One Missouri woman recalled, "We didn't have money for coal, but we had quilts, and that kept us from freezing." And quilts weren't just for survival. They were auctioned to raise funds for school lunches and hospital bills. In 1933, a single community quilt in Nebraska raised $27, enough to buy a ton of coal, a fortune in those days. Stay close, because next you'll see how whittling turned idle hours into a source of dignity, income, and sometimes pure joy. Whittling. Most people think whittling was just something old men did on the porch. But during the Great Depression, it became an essential way to survive and to hold on to pride when money disappeared. Imagine a father in Oklahoma in 1932. He's lost his farm to foreclosure, and his children haven't had a new toy in years. So he sits by the stove each night, shaping scraps of pine into animals, puzzles, and tiny figurines. In towns across America, whittling wasn't only a pastime. It was a way to barter, to soothe anxiety, and to create something that felt permanent in a collapsing world. Sears catalogs in the 1930s sold pocket knives for as little as 35 cents, which meant even the poorest families could afford a tool to start carving. In some regions, whittled items became a local currency. A well-made checker set might trade for a sack of potatoes. A pair of hand-carved spoons could earn enough to buy a few pounds of flour. One Nebraska boy named Clarence became famous in his county for carving over 200 wooden toys, trucks, trains, and animal figures, which he sold at the Saturday market. His family survived 2 winters largely on the coins he earned. And here's a detail most people don't realize. Whittling circles formed in many towns where neighbors gathered to share patterns and teach beginners. It wasn't only about the finished piece, it was about community, quiet focus, and the small thrill of turning nothing into something. Stay with me, because next you'll discover how families turned scraps, buttons, and cardboard into games that brought laughter back into homes that hadn't heard it in years. Homemade games and toys. You'd be amazed how creative families became when store-bought toys vanished from reach. In the 1930s, making your own entertainment wasn't a novelty. It was the only way children could still be children. Picture a kitchen table in Kansas, 1933. A mother carefully sketches a checkerboard onto a piece of salvaged cardboard. Her son sorts bottle caps, some painted red, some left silver, to use as playing pieces. For the next 3 winters, that homemade set is their evening entertainment. During the Depression, over 35% of American households reported making toys from scratch. Corn husk dolls were especially common, simple figures stuffed with rags and stitched with whatever thread could be spared. Boys carved slingshots and spinning tops out of scrap lumber. Girls fashioned paper dolls from old catalog pages. One Iowa family built an entire tabletop bowling game using broom handles and wooden spools. Another community in Arkansas held toy swaps, where families traded handmade creations so children could have something new at Christmas. And here's a little-known fact. The earliest Monopoly sets were homemade. Before Parker Brothers began mass production in 1935, families drew their own boards on oilcloth or cardboard. It became a phenomenon because it let people fantasize about property and wealth while living on pennies a day. These games weren't just distractions. They were proof that imagination could outlast poverty. Even when the pantry was bare and the wind rattled the windows, laughter over a handmade game was a defiant reminder that joy couldn't be bought or stolen by hard times. Stay close, because next you'll see how sewing and mending became an art form that saved families from both cold and shame. Sewing and mending. Most people today can't imagine a time when a torn sleeve was a crisis. In the 1930s, sewing wasn't just a skill. It was the only way to keep your children clothed and your dignity intact. By 1933, with unemployment above 24%, new garments were a luxury few could afford. Flour companies quickly realized families were repurposing their cotton sacks into dresses, shirts, and undergarments. To encourage loyalty, millers began printing the sacks with bright floral or plaid patterns. By the mid-1930s, more than 3 million American children wore flour sack clothing. Some companies even included instructions for removing the brand logos with lye soap. One Oklahoma woman remembered, "I saved feed sacks for a year to sew my daughter's Christmas dress. It was the prettiest thing we ever owned." In small towns, sewing circles became weekly rituals. Neighbors traded buttons and fabric scraps, shared patterns, and swapped stories over coffee. And here's something you probably didn't know. The federal government encouraged these gatherings. The Works Progress Administration organized sewing rooms where women repaired donated clothing and stitched thousands of garments for relief programs. In 1936 alone, WPA sewing rooms produced over 25 million pieces of clothing and bedding. Mending wasn't just practical, it was creative. Old coats were cut down into vests. Worn trousers became patchwork quilts. Even flour sack labels were turned into colorful appliques to brighten drab wardrobes. If you think sewing was only about saving money, remember, every careful stitch was also a declaration. We will not be undone by hard times. Stay here, because next you'll see how these crafts quietly kept people sane when everything else seemed to unravel. The secret power of crafting through crisis. Most people think Depression-era crafts were only about survival. But behind every quilt and carved toy was something deeper. Small acts of creation that kept despair at bay when the world felt broken. During the 1930s, rates of depression and anxiety soared. A 1932 survey found that nearly 1 in 4 families reported emotional strain so severe it disrupted daily life. But with no access to therapy and little understanding of mental health, people turned to their hands for relief. Crafting offered focus and routine in chaos. Quilting bees gave isolated women a chance to gather, talk openly about their struggles, and feel less alone. One Kansas woman wrote in her diary, "When we sew together, it feels like maybe we can hold each other up." Whittling circles served the same purpose for men, many of whom felt crushed by losing their jobs. Carving chess pieces or spoon handles wasn't trivial. It was a way to reclaim purpose and skill. Some communities even organized craft competitions, offering small prizes to keep spirits up. A 1935 WPA report concluded, "Recreational handcrafts are as essential to morale as relief rations are to sustenance." At the peak of WPA programs, more than 45,000 women worked in sewing rooms, creating clothing while forming supportive networks that often became lifelines. And here's a detail most forget. Many children cherished the memory of watching their parents make things. Decades later, they described those evenings by lamplight as the moments that felt safest, when creation chased the darkness back to the corners. Stay with me, because next you'll see why these humble crafts are finding new life as powerful tools for mindfulness and connection in our own uncertain times. Why vintage crafts still matter today. You might think Depression-era crafts are quaint relics, but look closer. These same traditions are thriving again. In times of uncertainty, people instinctively reach for their hands to quiet their minds and connect with something lasting. During the COVID-19 pandemic, sales of sewing machines in the U.S. surged by over 30%, echoing the 1930s rush to make and mend. Quilting guilds reported record membership growth. One national survey found that more than 12 million Americans took up a new handcraft hobby in 2020 alone. And it's not only about nostalgia. Modern studies confirm what depression families knew intuitively. Crafting can reduce anxiety, improve mood, and build community. A 2013 study published in the British Journal of Occupational Therapy found that 81% of knitters reported feeling happier after working on their projects. Many of the same skills depression families relied on have returned as both creative outlets and statements of resilience. Flour sack quilting inspired today's upcycled fashion. Whittling groups share patterns on forums and YouTube channels, connecting carvers across continents. Even homemade board games are seeing a revival, with families designing their own as an antidote to screens. One quilter in California recently told the New York Times, "When I piece a quilt, I feel connected to my grandmother who survived the Dust Bowl. She made beauty out of scraps, and I think that spirit lives in all of us." If these stories moved you, subscribe now. You're part of a community that honors resilience. Share this video and try one of these crafts yourself. History lives in our hands.